What happens when a war isn't fought between nations, but within one? What happens when the man you're aiming at shares your bloodline? The American Civil War wasn't just a national crisis. For thousands of Americans, it was a deep personal tragedy. The phrase brother against brother wasn't a metaphor in this war. It was a reality in homes across the North and South. In today's episode, we are going to talk about the effect the Civil War had on families all throughout America, and then we're going to compare it to modern day political polarization between parties. I hope you guys enjoy this episode, and I hope you learn a lot.
And some, I assume, are good people.
I will note that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima.
You need to pray for the good Lord to protect America.
Won the race of discovery against the Germans.
The first thing we're going to look at is a story about the Crittenden family. Now, John J. Crittenden was a Kentucky politician, and he had two sons, George Crittenden and Thomas Crittenden. So George and Thomas, both of them, when the Civil War broke out, they both had loyalties on either side. In the end, Thomas Crittenden chose to be a Union general, and George chose to fight for the Confederacy. And they literally stood at two opposite sides of the battlefield at one point or another during the Civil War. Obviously, not all families were like this during the Civil War, but this really does emphasize the effect that the Civil War had, especially on this certain family, the family of a Kentucky politician. Obviously, Kentucky was a border state too. A lot of this happened in border states like Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Maryland. And they were breeding grounds for fracture within families. Whole towns even split down the middle for support for the North and support for the South. Mary Todd Lincoln, the wife of Abraham Lincoln, had half-brothers fighting for both sides, and many died in service. You know, there are hundreds of stories like this. It really just emphasizes the effect that the Civil War had on family. We can also look at letters that soldiers wrote home. For example, a Union soldier from Pennsylvania wrote, "I fear I will meet my cousin James, who has joined the rebels. God forgive me if I do." Others wrote that they prayed their bullets had missed when they realized who might be across the line. Letters often, censored emotional content. You didn't want to scare your family you're writing home to. But private diaries really didn't. Many tell of emotional paralysis after receiving news that a relative had died in battle by their own hand. I mean, can you imagine that? Just being put on a battlefield 200 years ago. There's smoke everywhere, screams, men are dying, cavalry charge right next to you. You're just firing blindly at what you hope is the enemy. You get news later that you shot and killed your cousin. I just imagine that. Just imagine how traumatic that must be. And even there are specific events where family has met on the battlefield. At the Battle of Front Royal in 1862, Union Colonel John Kernley, his 1st Maryland Infantry, was overrun by the Confederate 1st Maryland Infantry, and many soldiers knew each other by name. Obviously, Maryland was a border state. Both border states raised troops for both sides, so you're bound to have a lot of interactions like that. I mean, I can't even imagine that. And some Confederate units used local knowledge of their former neighbors' tactics to gain an edge. A lot of the generals did that too, if you think about it, because they all went to West Point with each other. They knew each other's strategies. And yeah, I mean, I guess that's a good way to get a little bit of an edge on your enemy. In several early battles, such as Bull Run and Wilson's Creek, soldiers on both sides recognized friends from home firing on people they had once dined with. This is crazy, honestly. This is really crazy to even read and to hear about this stuff happening. It seems so foreign to us. We often feel that our country's divided. We often feel, and I think it is divided ideologically, but I don't think we're quite to that point as a nation where I can say, yeah, I can see myself, not that I want to fight my neighbor. I could see myself at some point in the future going to war with my neighbor. Or because we're so divided on political issues. I can't see that, right? And I don't think the U.S. is quite that far gone yet. And let's even take a step back and start to think about the possible effects of this. You killing your cousin on the battlefield. Oh, what were some of the effects of this? Families who lost sons on both sides. How do you properly mourn for that? My sons killed each other fighting for something they both believed in, but they believed in opposite things. How do you properly mourn that? Some households even refuse to acknowledge one brother's service if it was for the wrong side. Being rejected by your family because you joined the South, being rejected by their family because you joined the North, that has some effects. PTSD definitely wasn't named yet, but its symptoms were definitely real. Nightmares, alcohol abuse, and lifelong depression plagued thousands. He never spoke of the war again. It became a common line in memoirs, and we even hear that with, I've got great uncles, I've got great grandpas that fought in Vietnam, fought in World War II. They don't talk about the war. But imagine if the reason you're not talking about the war is because you fought your brother on the battlefield. It split your family. This war split your family. That's just a whole nother level of trauma. And Union and Confederate cemeteries, they hold siblings buried miles apart. And families aren't willing to bridge that gap. And decades later, reunions bring together old foes, sometimes from the same bloodline, the same family. At Gettysburg's 50th reunion in 1913, blue and gray veterans shook hands over stone walls, some with tears and some with bitterness. In many southern towns, the memory of the brother who betrayed his family still lingers in their family lore. And that makes sense. You think about the North, there was a lot of immigrants, there wasn't quite that same family tie, you were more of an individual in the North, and you didn't take quite as much of your identity from your family. Like in the South, you see these very, very close family bonds in the South. I can see how that would hit the South a lot harder, to have your brother run off and join the Union Army. I can see how that would be a lot more of a problem in these southern states. And civil wars are still happening around the world today. Like I said, this is not the only civil war that has had the same effect, but I do feel like since it's in the United States, we can take the time and compare it to our own present events. For example, there have been a ton of very, very controversial elections in the past few years in the United States. We can compare these deep family cuts and ties that happened in the Civil War to modern elections, modern political parties. I've had friends, I know people who they just don't talk to their family anymore because they don't see eye to eye on political matters. They don't really have that they can't sympathize with their family when it comes to who they voted for, who they, supported in an election, and it's not quite the same thing. It's not the same effect. Obviously, I'm not, going to war with my neighbor, like I said. It is a good comparison to make, though. Like 2020 election, Trump versus Biden. That was so polarizing. I know people who don't even talk to their friends anymore because of the decision they made to vote for their candidate that they supported, that they believed in, that certain ideology, they believed in it, and they just can't see eye to eye on that. We're not going to war yet. Like I said, we're not going to war, but these effects are still very, very good to talk about, and I think we need to have these conversations. We need to draw these parallels between the past to the present, and drawing these parallels is not actually solving the problem, because you know how the problem was solved last time? It was solved by a war, and sometimes those scars are still around today. We need to sit down, we need to talk, and we need to have conversations about these disagreements we have. We can't just automatically blame the other side, call them names, accuse them. We need to hear them out, and we need to have a conversation, a nice, reasonable conversation with the other side. I think it's important, and if that's where this podcast goes at any point, I would love that. I would love to have conversations with people on the other side. Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode today. I actually really hope you guys learned something from this episode. It was really good, really fun to make. I think I might do a couple more on the Civil War. I can't wait to tell you guys my opinion on the different ideologies in the Civil War. But I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I really do. And you know what? I'll see you guys in the next episode. Have a good day and God bless.